I'm live. Thank God. I thought for a minute I wasn't. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second Ask Me Anything. I'm now primed for this question fest because on the 25th of this week, Friday, I'm going up to Barnsley Civic Theatre to do a show, which is called Parky on Parky, in which I talk about my father and his life and his career and all the great clips and people he interviewed. So I am full of knowledge about my father, his life, his career. So there's absolutely no way that you're going to ask me a question that I cannot answer. So in fact, having said that, I have a few questions here already, and I'm going to answer them. I've got a lovely, look at this, isn't that nice? I've got some nice little question things. I like I'm appearing on Daytime Live. It's brilliant, fantastic. So I'm going to read some of these out, and I'm going to answer them in time. So the first one's, and forgive me if I mispronounce your surname, it's Lyra Semsadini. It says, can you share a time when your father might have had a difficult time or interview in his career and how he overcame it? Well, I can actually tell you both, if you would like. The most difficult time in my father's career actually came, oddly, when he was at the BBC and he was about to leave in 1981. He left in 1981 for a couple of reasons. One, he'd fallen out of love with the show. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he lost his father a few years earlier. And that was a cataclysmic event in my dad's life because, a bit like most people of his generation, he didn't feel that the man that he loved and idolized, didn't feel he'd had enough time with him, didn't feel enough time to speak to him properly, didn't feel he had enough time to say thank you to him. And I think he always carried that with him. At the same time, he had a bit of a falling out with the BBC over the fact that my dad always wanted to do a 5 nights a week talk show, always thought that he could do that, thought that he could create a situation where, you know, he could get over the fact that we don't have Hollywood on our doorstep by just creating a kind of gang show. The BBC had other ideas for various reasons and compromised on 2 nights a week, which really didn't suit my father at all. And really, after that was decided, probably in about 1979, he essentially began to look elsewhere and look outside of the BBC. And he left in 1981 and went to join the Gang of Four to do the ill-fated TVAM. Of course, that's another tale. And we all know what happened with that. That was a very difficult time, an experiment that was kind of, again, spoilt by the fact that the BBC jumped the gun and gone on air before them, but also because it was a new channel and no one really knew what they were doing, and more people were more interested in internal politics than they were in making television. So again, that didn't work out. It was a tough time for my dad, that. And he did have Australia. He was working out there, which he loved. It was a sojourn for him. But he was sort of lost, really, because he kind of didn't know where next that he could go in his homeland. And what he'd always did, is fall back on the one thing he could always do, which was writing. He was a brilliant writer. He was probably better at writing than anything else he did. And he began to become a jobbing journalist again. And my father also had the ability, he never had a massive ego. So he didn't really care as long as he went and got work. And that's what he did. He went out there and became a freelancer. And he just kept going forward. He kept, as Churchill once said, buggering on. And he did. And he wrote for newspapers and he did game shows and he just kept going. And all the way through the 80s and the 90s, that's what he did. And that's how he overcame that difficult period, which I think is a lesson for anyone who works in the media. It's difficult nowadays, different business altogether. But I think in any kind of walk of life, it's that idea that sometimes the path to success is not always that smooth. Now, in terms of an interview, well, I'm going to be less serious about this interview. It was with Robert Mitchum. And the problem with Robert Mitchum was that Robert Mitchum, let us say, had imbibed of an illegal herb before he came on the show. And so Robert was very, very relaxed. Robert didn't realize that the show was being recorded. Robert thought that he was sitting in a studio with my father having a very nice conversation. So Robert didn't think that he had to answer questions that he didn't want to answer. So unfortunately, this one-man show descended into my father asking a series of questions to which Robert answered yep or nope. And that's not very good for an interview show, particularly one where my father liked to have the guests do most of the talking. My father got so desperate that he thought, I'm going to ask him an open-ended question to which he can't say yep or no. So he asked him a question. He said, have you ever been in a bar fight? And Robert said, yep. So my father said, right, I'm going to ask him a question. What happened is the question he cannot answer yep or no to. And Robert, he could suddenly see that the veil fell from Robert's eyes. And he looked at my father and said, well, let me tell you. So I was in a bar fight. He said, what happened? I was in a bar. I was having some food with a friend of mine. And this guy came up to me and he thrust his piece of paper in front of me. I had my fork coming towards my mouth. And he said, there you go, Mitchum. Sign that, you son of a bitch. And he said, my father said, what happened? He said, well, I pushed the paper away. I looked up at the man and I said, when I finish my food, Pilgrim. And he went back to eating. Whereupon the man thrust the paper again and said, damn you, Mitchum, sign this. And my father said, what did you do? He said, well, I got my fork and I put my hand on top of the man's head and I pressed the fork up through his neck and I pushed it down, reached inside his mouth and pulled it out the other end. And my father was shocked. And then suddenly it dawned on me, he said, is that a true story? And Robert went, nope. That is how my father dealt with a terribly difficult interview. Actually, it was so bad that when the interview finished, Roy Mitchum turned to my father and said, can we do that again? Because he suddenly realized how bad it really was. So I hope that answers your question. Next one is Lucy. From your perspective, what do you think was the defining moments of your father's career? Well, I have spoken about this in the previous Ask Me Anything. I think that one of the defining moments was in the 60s when he moved to Manchester to start working at Granada Television. And I've said this before, it's because he was there at a time when the whole of the Northwest exploded in the Cultural Revolution, and everything that was developing and everything that was revolutionary in the world of television, film, music, the arts were there. All the actors, the writers, and certainly the musicians. And he was there as a producer of a show called Scene at 6:30. And their resident band was a band called the Beatles. They didn't know they were the Beatles until they turned up. And they said, Dad asked them what their name was. Said, oh, and Paul said, oh, well, we're called the Beatles. And that was what it was like. And in the end, you know, Dad only lost the Beatles because they went down to London one day, recorded a record. When they came back up, people was following them down Canal Street. Extraordinary time. And from a perspective that it was manned, Granada Television, by people of my father's background. Television up until then was an extraordinary kind of middle-class preserve. You know, everyone talked in very patrician tones, and the whole of the BBC set the culture. Granada didn't. It kicked over the trestles of the establishment, and my father was part of that. And so these young, talented working-class men and women suddenly became the hot property, and that's what defined my father. And of course, it was the first time that he ever did a celebrity interview, and he claims that it was by accident. I claim it was a terrible fit of ego. He claimed that basically one day he was in the office and none of his reporters were there, and he got a phone call from someone who was a stringer down in London saying, oh, by the way, because Top of the Pops was being recorded up there at the same time, if that wasn't enough, we've got a band coming up, and the lead singer's quite intelligent, actually, so you should interview him. And he said, okay, I will do. He said, well, what's the guy's name? He said, his guy's called Mick Jagger, and the band's called Rolling Stones. He went, all right, we'll get him on then. And there's this wonderful piece of footage of my father interviewing in quite a posh voice to an equally posh-spoken Mick Jagger, asking him about how long he thinks his career in pop might last. To which Mick replies, probably about another year. And wonderful, innocent time. But that kind of set the scene for my father, and he went on from there. The second defining moment, I think, actually, interestingly, was later on in his career, where I think he thought that in the end, his career wasn't necessarily over, but his career was going to take a kind of a path that he never really thought it would happen. And that was, as I said, after he left the BBC in 81, he became a jobbing journalist, a very successful journalist, had a very good radio show. He did, has a little bit of television here and there, but in terms of doing the interview show, his first love, he never thought that would happen ever again, until a very sort of an enterprising producer at the BBC started to do this idea of doing these compilations, some of Ali, some of all the great interviews, and my father agreed to do them, and he filmed them in a little office he had in the back garden, and didn't think anything of them. And from that, he suddenly was rediscovered by the generation of television executives who had grown up watching him as children. And in 1998, he was given another chance to do the talk show, and it was the best time for him to do it, because he had He had essentially become a better interviewer by all the things, all the adversity he'd gone through, all the other stuff he'd done since he'd left Parkinson. He'd become a better interviewer. And he also had that indefinable quality that all the people that came on the show was. He had that age and gravitas, which meant that it really was a huge privilege for them to come on his show. And it really meant that he had the whip hand, rather than when in the 70s, when in many ways he was a younger man and he was almost too honored to have some of these guests on. So that was defining for him, because in a sense, I don't think I'd be here talking to you, and I don't think people would be looking at the clips that they are without that, because I think that's what has seared in people's minds what my father's legacy was on television. All right, Sarah, what was the favorite interview of your father's? This is the most difficult question, I have to tell you. If my father was doing this, he'd tell you 4 different or 5 different answers. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you some of the favorite interviews, not the favorite interviews. So the one favorite interview which we love showing when we used to do the show together was a woman called Catherine Branwell Booth. And she is I'm afraid, the granddaughter of the man who founded the Salvation Army. And the reason she got on the show was because, actually, as I said earlier, my father was getting a bit fed up, and he was looking around for some different kind of guest, something that would not necessarily be coming on and talking about a film. He wanted some other indefinable person, a kind of national treasure type figure. And a researcher said, I was reading the other day about a woman who, at the age of 95, who just won the Speaker of the Year award. And he said, who's that? He said, it's Catherine Branwell Booth. So we'll go and interview her. And she did, and she went to interview him and came back a report and said, she is absolutely wonderful. The only problem is she hasn't got a clue who you are because she doesn't have a television. So he said, we'll just get her anyway. So they got her on, and it was absolutely extraordinary because it was a clash where this woman did not know who my father was, barely tolerated his questions. And when she did answer his questions, she did it with a real glint in her eye. And it was just a wonderful meeting of 2 people of completely polar opposites. And it was an extraordinary, if you ever get a chance to see it, and hopefully we will get the BBC stuff on it, it's a great, great interview, heartwarming. The interesting thing about it is, it's a real antidote to what is happening nowadays, where we're all obsessed about age and obsessed about the eternal elixir of youth. I would like to get old like she got old, because I tell you what, she was so full of life, so full of vitality, so full of wisdom and knowledge. And that's what we really are at risk of losing if we just consign the people who we think are too old to the kind of virtual corner of the room. And that's what my father loved. The other thing is one that actually, hopefully, we'll be getting on the scene on the actual site quite soon, which is a wonderful interview with a man called Kerry Packer. He was the guy who transformed cricket. He transformed sport, the way it was shot, the way it was covered. And he was Australian. He was a massive figure in Australia, very controversial figure, almost uninterviewable because he was, in a sense, people didn't like him. And my father got him on the ABC. And my father was really anti what he had done. He had gone in, he created this thing called one-day cricket, had gone against the MCC, had even insulted his great hero, Geoffrey Boycott. So my father went at him and tried to really nail him on this thing. And unfortunately, what Dad discovered was that Kerry was an extraordinarily intelligent, cultured, rather thoughtful, rather very considered man. And this was an extraordinary moment, for not just for my father, who had absolutely had this idea in his head that if this braggart, this arrogant man who'd come and destroyed his beloved game, but also to Australians. It transformed the way Kerry Packer and the Packer family were looked at. It's one to have a look at. It's an extraordinary interview. It really is. That's answered that. Now, Alex Pye has asked me, were there any surprise moments in one of your dad's interviews that really stood out to you? There is one. There's a couple. I don't know if you remember Val Dunigan. He was a lovely old man, great singer. Had a TV show in the 70s or 80s. Used to wear some lovely knitwear and sit in a rocking chair and sing little gentle folk songs. It was a time when television was joyful, really, and people didn't have much choice, so they sat and watched Val. It was kind of like, Mogadon for a Sunday night. Anyway, no, that's not fair. He was lovely. Anyway, what was interesting about Val was he came on the show, and my father, liked Val because he was lovely, gentle, funny Irishman, full of great tales. And he asked him about his dad, because he always talked about his dad in very kind of reverent tones. And all of a sudden, Val told him this story. And I won't really spoil it for you, but the upshot is that he told the story about the time he found out that his father had got terminal cancer, and the fact that he was the only person in the family. And the reason he found out was because, and I will tell you this, is he went outside, and his father was spending a lot more time out of the house. For some reason, he was in his shed a lot and was out of the house. And he went out, and he went to the side of where his father was, and he saw outside these nettle leaves, and he wondered what they were. And he asked his father for them, and his father told him that they were an old kind of remedy for cancer, and he was trying to cure himself using old country remedies. And it was an extraordinary story. I won't ruin it because I don't tell it very well. I can't tell it very well because it didn't happen to me. But he said at the end, I don't know why I've told you that. I've never, ever said that to him, ever. And another thing happened with Kirk Douglas, same thing about fathers. It's very interesting. My father asked his guests about their father. It's in the book that we wrote together called Like Father, Like Son. There's a fascination from my father about relationships particularly between sons and fathers. The closeness, the difficulty navigating their relationship. And Kirk Douglas told a similar story about, he came from a dirt poor family. He came from a Russian Jew emigre family, and he had a brutal, violent, hard father, but he was hard and brutal because of his upbringing. And he told a story about the time that he flicked some hot tea at him during a meal because he just was fed up with the way that he scared everyone. And again, it was something he revealed. It's too extraordinary. The reason why it happens, I think, is because my father created an atmosphere where people felt comfortable. They forgot they were talking to millions out there and hundreds out there. He just made it as if he was talking to them. So that was really, really good. I had one from Tess, actually, which has now disappeared. Oh, okay. Well, did your dad ever talk in a Meg Ryan again after that infamous interview? No, of course he didn't talk to Meg Ryan after that infamous interview. I mean, the thing about the Meg Ryan interview, people have to misunderstand it, is that my father is the first to admit that he didn't handle it very well at all. I mean, he basically got grumpy, and he got grumpy unnecessarily with someone. But then you have to understand the background to it. The background to that interview was very clear, that Meg did not want to be on the show. My dad normally used to go around to their dressing rooms beforehand to say hello. He knocked on the door. The door was opened by a very harassed looking PR person, and he walked in to say hello to Meg, and Meg didn't want to say hello to him because Meg was on one side of the dressing room staring intently into the mirror, and the whole of her entourage were on the other side staring intently at each other. So it was quite clear that people weren't very happy, and Meg had come on, and she wasn't very comfortable about the film that she was promoting in the cut. And she also had a bit of a heartbreak. I think Russell Crowe she split up with her. So she wasn't in a good place. And my father kind of thought, this is not going to go well. And she came on, and she made it quite clear that she wasn't particularly interested in being there. And also she did the one thing that really annoyed my father, was that he always made every single guest sit backstage and watch everyone else on the show, because he wanted them to feel they were part of that dinner party idea, so they could maybe cross-reference what they were talking about. And he asked the question when she came on, what did you think about Trinny and Susanna, what they were talking about? And she said, oh, were you talking about fashion? Making out that she hadn't watched what was going on. So he reacted in a way. No, they didn't speak afterwards at all, not at all. They didn't exchange Christmas cards. But then, why would they? I mean, the interview is an artifice, isn't it? I mean, it's all about consensual. I mean, people don't go on a talk show because they love the person they're going on to. They go on a talk show because they're flogging something. And the only kind of agreement they have with the host is, I will answer your questions as long as you let me play the clip from my film. So, yes, it wasn't the finest moment. But, I think if that's the only couple of things you can point out, I think he had a pretty good career. What's the next big development in AI when it comes to the entertainment industry? I'm probably not the person to ask for that. There are many other people who are much much more qualified. People I work with who do like Benfield and Jay Henderson have a lot more to say about that. I think I can only talk from my perspective, is that I think that actually from my, I just honestly feel that what happened during the AI podcast threw up some extraordinary issues, extraordinary kind of developments, which I think if we can bore into that a little bit more, could actually reap some incredible dividends. The most important thing, though, and there's a reason why I wanted to do it with my father, is it's done ethically, and it's done so that no one, not like what Meta has done or has been accused of doing, which is training their AI model on books that they've got no permission for. That's not acceptable. It has to be done in a way that is ethical and is legal. Right. So Gina says, I think the best interviews with Muhammad Ali. Well, yeah, they're not interviews though. I mean, my father described them as, you know, he went in the ring 4 times with Muhammad Ali and lost every one because Muhammad was as we described him in the book that we wrote. He's like a kaleidoscope of a man. As soon as you tried to pin him down, he twisted and there was something else. And he just wanted to make sure that he got his message across. And so if he wasn't feeling that you're asking the question to get message across, he'd do it anyway. What is very interesting about Muhammad Ali is that we are doing a play at the moment. We're developing a play which should hopefully come out in 2026. It's about Parky and Ali. It's about the 4 interviews. And what's fascinating about those 4 interviews is it traces a very similar arc in Ali's life and my father's life. Because when they first interviewed in 71, my father was a contender. He was just starting out. Ali was coming back and he was a contender. He just lost to Frasier. He just lost the world title. So he was on the comeback trail. My father was beginning. 74, when they had 2 interviews together, they were at the height of their fame, both of them, in their respective fields. And so they were kind of at their zenith, and their interviews, therefore, were much more combative. That's the famous time in 74 where, you know, they had a terrible clash, terrible rout, mainly because my father just felt that he was at a very similar level to him. And then 81 is a very kind of melancholic interview for the 2 of them. My father was on the way out the door. He was leaving the BBC, and Ali was showing the first signs of that disease that eventually took him, which was a real shame. So we're looking at that from a perspective to say how these 2 lives intersected over these interviews. They weren't interviews really; they were encounters. But they were extraordinary to watch. They really are. Again, what did your father think of Peter Kay? He thought Peter Kay was a very cheeky individual. I'll tell you why. Because Peter Kay was his warm-up man when he was at the BBC. He came in one day and his regular warm-up man had disappeared. He'd been ill. And this rather young, you know, chubby lad was sitting in my father's chair. And he was thinking, who's this pup? And he went over and he said, sorry, who are you? He said, you don't know me. He said, but you'll be interviewing me in a few years. He said, I'm as funny as Billy Connolly. He went, oh, all right, what's your name? He said, Peter Kay. He went, all right, Peter. Well, anyway, it's very nice to meet you. And lo and behold, a few years later, he walked down the stairs and my father absolutely adored Peter Kay because Peter Kay was a throwback. He was the kind of modern incarnation of all those great comedians that my dad loved, like Cooper and, you know, Les Dawson and all those wonderful kind of front of cloth comedians. He was a throwback comedian. I mean, Billy was a kind of an outlier. He's a genius. There's no one ever going to be like him. He's like a Shane Warne in cricket. There aren't anyone like they break the mold. Peter Kay was a throwback to that front of cloth, end of peer comedian, and he just is. My dad loved him, and he'll have him on any time. And he was obviously on the last show, which was just hilarious because he said to me beforehand, because I was producing the show, I said, Peter, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm not telling you. I said, what do you mean you're not telling me? I said, is this the last show, Peter? I need to know. He said, I'm not telling you. And when he turned up with a bag and wouldn't show me what was in the bag, and of course then revealed it was a lollipop man's outfit. I mean, it was just chaos anyway, but it was wonderful. Are there any raw edited versions of Park's interview out there? Could they be released? No, they're not actually, but I have to say they don't need to be because my father recorded us live. So every single interview you see, the editing is incredibly light. Few exceptions only. He would literally record almost 2 times. And I will vouch for that, mainly because the BBC, you couldn't edit then because it was literally a case of film and put some poor person chopping their fingers off trying to actually cut it out with a razor blade. And there were a number of occasions when my father had to phone up the head of BBC to ask for an overrun because he'd gone on for too long. But at ITV, he would say, I'm doing 15 minutes and that's it. And then I literally would take out the stuff that didn't, I would slightly reorder it, whatever. But no, there's nothing on the cutting room floor that was revelatory at all, because he was such a gifted interviewer in that sense. And he also had a most innate sense of time. He didn't have an earpiece. He just had someone saying how long he'd done an interview, and he would know exactly to the point where he was an interview. It was extraordinary. Are there any? I like your father's interview, Olivia Newton-John. Well, he liked it as well because she was a lovely woman. He interviewed her here and also in Australia when he was over there. So good chatting. I was Team Frasier all the way. Well, if you were Team Frasier, you're quite right. My father was Team Frasier all the way because he rather liked Joe Frasier. He didn't like the way that Muhammad Ali treated him at all. Muhammad Ali was awful to Joe Frasier. He was a very, very pleasant man. My father actually went to a training camp when he was doing the interview out in '74, and he did a sparring session with Joe Frasier. Not really a sparring session. He just was meant to circle around and have a bit of a joke with him. And my father got a little bit cocky during it, and unfortunately flicked Joe Frasier, unfortunately, on the chin, which Joe Frasier wasn't very happy. So Joe Frasier just gently cuffed my father. My father had to sit down for about half an hour because there were bells ringing in his ears. And he thought, well, if he did that with a flick, if he hit me properly, that would be the end of my life. Dear. There we go. So scroll down. Okay, I can't scroll now. Oh dear. I'm not very good at this technical stuff. I'm trying to find the yeah. Right. No, I can't seem to scroll up, I'm afraid. Sorry. This is good, isn't it? My glamorous assistant will come and help me. Oh yeah, right. Here we go. Right. So yes. Right. So I got one from Tess actually. Can you share a story about his most memorable interview? Was it Rod Hullany? Oh, Rod Hullany. Yeah. That wasn't his favourite memorable interview. That was a disaster for him. But of course, he knew what was happening when it happened, when he got attacked by the emu. He was making great television. Of course he was. It was just wonderful from that point of view. But I mean, the Oliver Reed, I have a slight problem with Oliver Reed, is that I don't want to sound pompous, but the problem with Oliver is that Oliver was an incredibly gifted actor. He was probably one of our most charismatic and memorable kind of film actors. But we remember him because of his drunken antics, and we laugh about that. But what we're really laughing at is a man who's essentially destroying himself in front of us. But having said that, there was an hilarious incident where the set had to be rebuilt when Oliver was on, because Oliver had decided that during rehearsal, normally what happens is that you walk down the stairs and you just basically do that, and then you talk to it. You just rehearse, see what's going to happen, and you listen to your walk down music. And Oliver decided that during rehearsal, he wouldn't walk down the stairs. He'd emerge through the back of the set. He would punch his way through the set and emerge through the debris, and which is what he did. So therefore, he did that in rehearsal, which meant that they had to basically rebuild the entire set. So that was Oliver's introduction to the show. The other thing that my father witnessed about Oliver Reed, which was an amusing story, but again, it does involve, sadly, Oliver being drunk, was that he was playing a charity cricket match. And he was playing in the same side as Oliver. And he went out to bat, and Oliver was in next, and my dad got out. And as he walked towards the pavilion, he saw Oliver Reed walking towards him, dressed like Omar Sharif from Lawrence of Arabia, carrying a bat in one hand and a jug, which certainly wasn't, it looked like it was orange juice, but it was not necessarily all orange juice, in the other hand. He went out to the bat, and my father took his position in the pavilion. He happened to be next door to Oliver Reed's father, who was looking at this scene, and my father thought it was probably politic to say nothing. So Oliver was went into bat, and he put his jug of orange juice behind the stumps, took his guard, and was promptly bowled first ball. He then took a bow, bent over, exposed his bum, and then drank the entire contents of the aforesaid jug of orange juice. He then tottered off the field. My father again thought it's probably best not to say anything. He didn't need to, because Oliver Reed's father turned to my father and said, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Which is probably not the greatest thing that you could hear from your father. But there, that was, yeah, he was. I mean, it was sad. I mean, interestingly about Oliver Reed, I remember watching that interview with Michael Aspel that they did, that famous one where he came on and he was terribly drunk, and he made a fool of himself. And Clive James was on the show, and Clive had his problems with drink, and he asked a wonderful question to Oliver when he'd calmed down and said, "Look, Oliver, why do you drink so much?" Which was a question that Oliver really couldn't answer. And the problem is that my father had a very strict rule about people and drink, was that he never allowed anyone on the show who was obviously drunk, and that was Oliver Reed as well. Oliver was not drunk when he was on the show. The closest he ever came to it was I think with Brian Clough. Brian Clough, he was drunk, and my father said to him, "Brian, if you continue drinking, you're not coming on the show." My father wouldn't do it because it's pointless. It's pointless having people on the show who are drunk, because it makes them look stupid. It makes them look silly, and it also exposes you as the interviewer that you should not do that, because you should take good care. Which is why I never liked the fact that on that occasion, Michael Aspel's team allowed Oliver to come on when he was in no fit state to perform like some kind of circus freak. And also when George Best went on the Terry Wogan show, and he was also quite understandably drunk. He was drunk, and he started to become foul-mouthed, and he looked terrible. And what benefit do you get from that? There's no benefit to you as an interviewer. There's no benefit to the man doing it. There's certainly no benefit to us as an audience. Watching people do that to themselves, it's very unedifying. I did have two people on the show that, apart from Robert Mitchum, who were necessarily not with him in the same room, and that was Elliot, and Dolan, Sullivan, who were on there to promote MASH, that wonderful film that they did when turned into a television series that actually they weren't in. And Oliver, and they were both on, and again, rather like Robert Mitchum, they had partaken of some herbal remedy, and basically both of them couldn't speak. And so in the end, when it comes down to it, later on, my father had a radio show, and Donald Sutherland came on the radio show, and he looked at my father. He said, "Before we go on air, I'd like to apologize." He said, "What for?" He said, "Because the last time he interviewed me," he said, "I was appalling." He said, I've never in my life been so embarrassed in my life." And he said, "But can I tell you something? It was all Elliot Gould's fault." My father said, "Don't kid her." Did you have a view on the modern combative interviews like Piers Morgan? I don't think Piers is combative. I think Piers is combative with certain people. I think my father never compared himself to Piers, because Piers' show, Live Stories, was not like his show. I mean, I've been there at the recording. I mean, I don't want to be facetious, but I mean, I would start crying if I had to be recorded for 3.5 hours, which is what happens. And that's fine. That's how he does it. It's very much a cross between This Is Your Life and a kind of a sort of Life and Times interview. Piers is an extraordinarily good broadcaster. And in many ways, he's an incredibly brave person in some ways, because what he does is he takes on issues when it's certainly in American politics, which people like the gun regulations that people wouldn't touch. But he's not really, he doesn't really operate in the same field as my father. So it's difficult to have really an opinion on him. Did you ever meet Terry Wogan? I did meet Terry. He was wonderful, a wonderful man. He was a great guy, very funny, just like he was actually. He was one of those great qualities in broadcast, right like my father, who was just like himself on screen as he was off screen. What was your dad like to work with? Well, he was interesting, actually. What was fascinating about my father was that he was this strange mixture between being a producer and a performer. So he had opinions on both sides. So he had opinions about how it should be done and opinions about how it should be made. And he was very exacting. He expected you to exactly not do what he wanted, but do it in a way that he thought should be done. But he was also a great enabler in a way that he wasn't all over it. I mean, when he employed you and you told you to do a job, he left you to do it. So with me, it was very interesting when I took over as producer. I made it very clear that, that either I work as a producer or I don't, because it was, people would be looking at that relationship and think, well, what's the dynamic there? So he'd leave me to edit. He would never come into the edit. He'd never question my edits. He would only maybe have a conversation afterwards. And he was incredibly supportive when, let us say, the nasty stuff hit the wall. He was very protective. He stood in front of you. He said, it's my show. If someone goes wrong, I'll take the blame. But he was difficult, like any performer's difficult. I mean, they just are. They live on their nerves. They live on their ego. And sometimes we would have some extraordinary rows. Hilarious, because we both have strong personalities. We both have strong opinions. And we would like to have a full and frank exchange of views, but it didn't necessarily mean what the great thing about him was, and also how I did it, was that we never took it home with us ever. We had a really fine delineation between us as a father and son and us as a kind of team and work together. And also, I suppose, it was more than that, the working relationship with my dad, because we went on to do so much more. We wrote 4 books together. We did a theatre show together, which is where this Barnsley Civic Theatre is coming from. I'm sort of effectively adapting it just for me. And we did lots of things. We produced archive shows together, and it was just a very fulfilling and a very complementary kind of working relationship, which had its challenges, obviously. Any relationship, particularly when it's personal. It can have challenges, but I've had some wonderful memories because of it. So what's next for the Parky legacy and you? Well, as I say, the 25th of April, I'm treading the balls at the Barnsley Civic to keep up a promise, actually, my father made 10 years ago when we performed there to promote the Muhammad Ali book we'd wrote. And my father said to them, we'll come and do a show, a fundraising show. And as John Lennon once said, life is what happens when you're busy making plans. And we never got around to it. And then, of course, when we could have done it, my father became too ill to do it. So when we're in the last year or so, and we knew that, he wasn't necessarily going to live much longer, we had various conversations about what we were going to do. And part of that was to say, look, I want you to make sure, not because of me, not because of my idea of keeping my memory alive, but actually because of the body of work that happened, because of the people that I happened to interview. Just try and keep the archive, the show alive. And one of the things he also wanted me to do was to keep the promise of the Barnsley Civic. So that's what I'm going to do on the 25th, is do the show called Parky on Parky. The YouTube channel is just going to go from strength to strength. I just feel incredibly strongly. In many ways, it's the one thing that's the real legacy is because the archive is so rich, and it's such a great way of keeping it in one place, and also be able to curate it properly and work with people who care about it and understand it. So that's going to go from strength to strength. As I said, we're going to go and do we've got this play coming up called Parky Ali in 2026, which is very exciting. I'm sort of helping to write it because it's difficult for the writers to write scenes which involve my mum and dad and all that. So I'm helping them with that. And then we're also thinking of doing, with an Australian company, a documentary about my father's life, which hopefully will be a kind of cinematic release, which would be lovely. I think that will be a great way of kind of, in a way, telling the story that people don't know. People kind of understand. People think my dad's story happened when he walked down the stairs of Parkinson. The really interesting story is a story from the time of where he was born up to the time he walked down the stairs. And that's the thing we're going to talk about then, I think. That's the interesting area. So And I think my dad would have loved this YouTube channel. You know why he would have loved it? I'll tell you 2 reasons. Weirdly, near the end, he started to want to watch his shows again, which he never used to do, really. He kind of was incredibly dismissive of it. I mean, that's why I always said before. I said that when he came to the end of the show, he kind of thought, oh, well, I'm leaving, so what? Didn't bother him. But he wanted to watch it near the end. And of course, it was quite difficult. If he'd had this resource, I mean, he couldn't have got on it. I'd had to get him on it. But if he'd had this resource to have done it, he would have loved it, because it would have reminded him of so many of the great memories that he had. And the weird thing is that we had a similar situation with Muhammad Ali, where I got a letter from his wife saying, please could you send me DVDs of the 4 interviews that your father did with Muhammad, because he's driving me mad, because he keeps asking me to search up the interviews on the computer, and I can't do it. They don't seem to be there. So it would be wonderful, wouldn't it? It'd be a great idea to think if my father and Ali were logged on at the same time to the Michael Parkinson YouTube channel, and they could have a little conversation, couldn't they? Saying, I nearly got you there, Mohammed. And he'd say, no, you didn't. I'd always had you. So that was it. Anyway, I think I've spoken long enough. Thank you again for coming on board and doing this. And I'll do another one, certainly in a few weeks or a couple of months' time. But if anybody is in the Barnsley area, as obviously it's the Mecca of the world, on April the 25th, there are a few tickets left, and I will be delighted to see you there, and all the money will be going to the Barnsley Civic. Thank you very much indeed. Take care, all of you, and speak to you soon.